At this stage, the final costing of construction can now be calculated. This figure should be similar to the figure used in your feasibility study if enough care and due diligence was taken. The contingency amount used in your feasibility study should accommodate for any slight variations in costing. However, this isn't an excuse to be sloppy with the figures you put into your feasibility study. The figures that go into this feasibility study should be as accurate as possible. As the old saying goes, garbage in, garbage out. The numbers that you enter into that feasibility study must be as accurate as possible. In property development, sometimes people ask about the crystal ball that's going to allow them to look into the future. If there was ever such a thing as a crystal ball in property development, the closest thing to it would be your feasibility study. Now that the engineering's been done, the next step is to apply for a building consent. For a development approval, you need both a planning consent and a building consent. To help step us through the process of gaining that building consent, we're going to be speaking with David Van Borg from Professional Building Services. David Van Borg is a private certifier and he'll tell us a bit about what we need to know about gaining that building consent. So let's go have a chat with David. So David, can you tell us a bit about your background?
I've been in the building approval and development process for about 30 years. I originally started in local government, where I did plan assessment, was also closely involved with planning, and in fact was probably a planner before they had planners. That's another story. In the last 10 years I've been a principal consultant here with Professional Building Services. It's a private certification business. That's effectively the same as a local government operation in that you still assess plans for a building approval or building consent as it's known. As I said, that's been for about the last 10 years, and ever since the government looked at introducing certification, there was a demand for it from the industry. Local government tended to become a little bit restricted in its view of building code matters, so they introduced a performance building code, and that opened up opportunities for innovation and a different approach to approvals, and hence the private certification of that building consent process meant that we could adapt to the performance building code. And that's primarily what I've been doing in the last 10 years. All aspects of private certification, building approval, building consents, existing buildings, fire safety, all those sorts of things.
So what exactly is private certification and what do you do?
Private certification is the assessment of building plans in order to get a building consent. It was introduced around about 15 years ago as there was a need in the industry to streamline building approval process, and they introduced what's called a performance-based building code, and together with that they introduced the privatisation of the assessment of building documents in order to get that building consent. So as a private certifier, that's what we do. We look at plans, we assess plans, we look at the structural integrity of the building, we look at the nuts and bolts aspects of the building, and utilise that building code and hopefully have enough information there to be able to issue you a building consent and in turn give that to council for an approval.
And how does certification fit into the overall building process?
Certification is part 2 of the overall process. Your first part is the planning consent, which has been dealt with by the planner. Once that's been gained, then as I said, we need to look at documentation in order to issue you a building consent. So we're step 2. The planning consent plus the building consent equals the full approval. And that's where we fit in, part 2. So we have to ensure that we've got the right documentation. We liaise with the builder, the architect, the engineers, whoever it may be, to ensure that we satisfy the legal requirements to have the right documentation and enable us to issue that consent or that approval, as some people would call it.
When should a private certifier be engaged?
It will depend on the size of the project, but if you've got a major project, certainly early engagement is worthwhile. There are a lot of aspects under the building code with major projects like fire safety, perhaps engineering, even energy efficiency, site conditions that may need some preliminary assessment. So it's worthwhile engaging a certifier early in that sense. A lot of that may well be worked out by the architect or the planner, but it's at that stage it would be worth knowing who your certifier is going to be, because if there are some questions at that stage, it's good to have the certifier on board then, and then that certifier is aware later on, and again that means they have an easier assessment role and there's a saving in time. So early engagement is very worthwhile.
So why would someone use a private certifier?
Private certifiers are focused on just the building consent stage. While they're aware of a lot of the planning issues, they know the processes involved, they're primarily involved in issuing a building consent. They're well experienced in that, well experienced in looking at performance-based codes. They have, again, a good understanding of how building code matters may impact on a development. So coming to a certifier, using a certifier early, means that you get a better combination of all the people involved in the development process. So just as a planner might pull together certain people for a planning consent, sometimes a certifier can pull together certain people as well in order to issue a building consent. Again, early involvement is, I think, good insurance later on. Everyone's aware of where they're going on a project, and if anything does crop up that needs an answer, your certifier usually is the person who's the most knowledgeable, most experienced. Most certifiers have had local government experience. Most of them come from local government, but with the introduction of performance-based codes and the new Building Code of Australia, a lot of those people now are in that private sector because it's enabled those initiatives to be put into place.
Does it take longer to use a private certifier?
No, generally it will be much quicker. There are legislative requirements in the Development Act and regulations that give timeframes on how long you should take to assess for a building consent. However, a local authority is allowed 6 to 8 weeks. A certifier, because of their knowledge, their expertise, their understanding of the process, you'll generally find that they will take from 2 to 4 weeks. So there is an enormous benefit, enormous saving in the timeframes by using a certifier.
What about cost savings?
Generally it will cost less. There are prescribed or scheduled fees in the Act and the regulations. Local authorities would tend to abide by those scheduled fees. Private certifiers are not bound by them, so certainly they are at liberty to charge what they like. Now, there may be an initial cost up front if you have an early engagement of a certifier, but that is good insurance again, because further down the track that will mean less time that will be required on assessment or less problems with that assessment. So cost-wise, it's a long-term benefit. Most certifiers would charge, in fact, also less than the scheduled fee, probably around 20%, as I know, for instance, with professional building services, their sort of flat rate is around about 20% what is the scheduled fee. There are fixed fees, there are fixed costs as well. They are government charges though. There are levies to pay, construction industry levies, a 5% state government levy. There are local government lodgement fees, but they are fixed rates. The base assessment fee by a certifier generally, I suggest, would be around about 20% cheaper than what you might get using a local authority.
So what you're saying is that it's essentially cheaper to use a private certifier and it will save you a lot more time.
Yes.
David, what are the legislative requirements of the process?
The legislation does require you to get a building consent. So when we ask for documentation, we ask for full plans, we ask for engineering details, specifications of the works, all of those items, they are prescribed in the legislation. So no matter who is doing that assessment, you have to have that information. That's important for a number of reasons. It's important for assessment purposes, so we know what we're approving. It's important for record purposes down the track, but it's also very important for your construction purposes, so that your builder knows what they're doing. So that if you're going to get quotes, your documentation is the same and well defined, so you're getting accurate quotes on what it is you want to build. So those sorts of things are really important. The legislation demands that we have to do an assessment in accordance with those details, and we have to have enough information to be able to say that we can issue a building approval or building consent under the Building Code of Australia. So that is the aim, and that's what we do.
And what about inspection during construction?
Again, documentation is very, very important for inspection purposes, whether it be a certifier who does it or the local authority who does it. Certifiers don't generally do inspections during the course of construction. It's usually the licensed contractors who must do it. And of course, councils have an enforcement role as well, not so much the certifier. But inspection is very important also down the track. That's why documentation on record is very important. You have an existing building, for example, we need to know some of the intricate construction details of that. It may impact on a further assessment. So documentation and inspection go hand in hand.
David, you mentioned before that a private certifier's role is to essentially put good documentation together. Would you say that if this is done effectively enough and there's no vagueness in the final plans, that builders have more of a chance of accurately costing the final project?
Definitely. It might sound a little bureaucratic, but certainly getting good documentation is of enormous benefit for a lot of reasons. Certainly in costing, so that builders are costing the same documentation and to a good level of accuracy and a level of degree of detail. Certainly as well, if there's anything that does happen to go wrong down the track, you have good recourse there. You have documentation to show how it should have been done so that you can correct issues down the track. And more than ever now, there is a distinct overlap between planning and building. A lot of building requirements are called up early in the planning process. Low-lying ground, drainage, fire safety, bushfire, all those sorts of aspects are things that are touched on at planning but need to be refined in the building documents. And we have to make sure that aspects of that planning are incorporated into building documents. So we have to ensure that it's consistent with the aim of the town planning. Therefore, you need good documentation to show that yes, you have abided by the conditions of the planning consent, you've incorporated any conditions maybe, you've made changes that they've asked for, or you've met specific objectives that they've asked for. So those things need to be included on the plans. And that enables us then to say, yes, this is consistent, it has met the objectives of the planning, therefore we have the right building, the right documentation to show that the building is able to be given a building approval. That's very good down the track for all those other reasons we mentioned as well. That it's good for record, it's good for inspection, those sorts of things. I think good documentation is very important for all those reasons. The need to have good documentation goes down to the builder, the building certifier and the rest of the people in the process. But for a builder, it's really important that the documentation is accurate so they cost accurately. So they have enough detail to give full costings of all the aspects of the construction. It's also very important then if during the course of construction, if something does go wrong or is omitted, that you've got recourse to come back to that documentation to say this is how it should be done. That's very important. There's also a very close relationship now between planning and building. A lot of aspects of building are touched on in the planning consent process, whether it be a low-lying piece of land or some drainage, it'd be energy efficiency, something of that nature. And some of those objectives or conditions on that planning consent have to be incorporated into building consent documents. So it's really important to make sure they are transferred across to those documents. That enables us then to say that it's consistent with the planning consent, it's consistent with those objectives, and we have enough information to be able to say, yes, that gets an approval. If it isn't, then we really run the risk of it going back to council as we think an approved set of documents, and they saying that, look, there are variations or omissions that means it's not consistent, and that may trigger a whole new development application. That becomes a very, very time-consuming exercise. You have to make some decisions then. Are you going to persist with wanting those variations, or are you going to go back to what the original proposal was? But that gets back to, again, making sure your early preparation is right, making sure you've engaged the right people, making sure you're clear on where you're going with your development, looking at your site, looking at aspects of low-lying, drainage, orientation, all those things. There's a lot of hidden costs that could be there? Do you have to fill the land? Do you have to excavate? Do you have major retaining walls? Do you have drainage issues? Do you have the whole building facing west, so you have massive window costs to now meet energy efficiency requirements, which is very much on the agenda. So early engagement is important, a good understanding of where you're going with the development, making sure you get the design right up front as best as you can, and you minimise variations so that when it comes to a building consent stage, it is a smooth process and we can approve it with confidence, knowing that we don't have to lodge a new application.
So how long do I have to wait before I can start working on the site?
Certainly site preparation is not an issue, but major excavation or filling is in itself development. Now, legally, you are meant to wait until you have what's called the full development approval, not just the issue of the building consent. Having said that, issuing the building consent means that effectively everything is okay. But we do still have to go back to council and make sure it's consistent, as we talked about. Site preparation, not a real problem. Demolition is something that you often want to get started with very early. That's also not a problem. It needs a separate application or approval, and the reason for that is because you need to ensure you don't have a heritage building. You may need to look at whether you've got significant trees. Some of those things are dealt with though at the planning stage. You need to be aware of that. Normally, once a building consent has been issued and it is consistent, and we send it off to the local authority is still the custodian of all plans, and they are the ones to say yes, it's consistent. They are meant to do that within 5 days. So we get back to, again, if you're using a certifier, you've got a fairly streamlined assessment process. Because of all the assessment being done by the certifier, and it then goes to the local authority, they have no assessment to do. All they do is look at it for consistency, and they are meant to deal with that within 5 days. So we have a fairly streamlined approach when you think about it. Thereafter, you've got your full approval from council, you can start work immediately.
What about variations to planning consent and sometimes conditions on planning consent?
Variations are a major issue, and as we've discussed, it is really worthwhile to try and make sure that you minimise variations. There are times when variations have to be made, and there is a legislative leeway there for us to be able to make some variations to an approved document if indeed there's some other legislative need for it. So for example, if you had a structural element that was in the way of a window, certainly you might be able to move the window or move some other aspect of the building in order to satisfy that other structural building code requirement. Those sort of things can be accommodated. Other variations, not so easy. If you wanted to add to the size of a building, generally that would trigger a whole new development application. You really need to be sure up front as much as possible that that is the project that you've settled on, and you need to stick with it. That is also important, of course, for the builder, that there aren't too many variations during that process. As far as conditions of planning consent are concerned, certainly again they have to be incorporated into the working drawings. There are some that can't be incorporated into working drawings and can't be part of a building consent, but it's important not to forget the conditions of a planning consent. Some of them may be landscaping issues that have to be done once the building is finished, but they're still part and parcel of getting your certificate of occupancy, for example, if it's a commercial development, and you have to go through those sorts of things before you will get that certificate of occupancy. And you want to avoid any problems with the local authority, enforcement-wise, to ensure that they don't turn up and say, why are you occupying a building when you haven't met all of the conditions of your approval? So planning consent and building consent, each of those can have conditions and they relate to the full approval. Some of them won't be applied until the building's almost finished. And as I said, landscaping for planning, or it could be fire safety matters for a major commercial project. Testing of fire services and those sorts of things. They have to be commissioned, air conditioning, all those sorts of issues. So they need to be addressed before you occupy a building. So you don't want variations as much as possible, and your conditions, you need to be careful that you are constantly reading what those conditions are and making sure that all of them are accommodated at the completion of the building.
In the event that some of the conditions could lead to a significant cost blowout, would the private certifier be the person that could go back and argue the conditions?
Possibly in certain instances. There are planning conditions that perhaps don't specifically relate to the building code. In that instance, that would be difficult, but there are also conditions that maybe relate to fill or excavation or retaining or the like, and there may be options at varying how you construct that, or how you perhaps put tiers into a level of filling instead of retaining all at one end, or perhaps thinking of different ways of being able to accommodate where parking or something goes. So as much as it can be dealt with at a planning stage, certainly we can assist in some ways with giving you ideas as to how you might be able to make variations that hopefully don't trigger a whole new development application and save you a lot of money.
Can a private certifier help with existing buildings that need to be redeveloped?
Dealing with existing buildings is a different process altogether sometimes. It might be a heritage building, and in order to meet current day requirements for the building code, impossible. And you'd have to demolish it and start again. Well, you can't demolish it because it's heritage. So you have to have a different approach. That's where that performance-based approach comes in. There's a section in the Act that allows you to make a decision as to whether a building is safe or unhealthy or whatever, and you then may have to look at how best to apply current day provisions, and you can't just apply everything. So you say, well, let's look at it this way, look at it at a performance base. What are the objectives? We have life safety or building safety, or how do people get out of a building? So what can we do to maybe achieve that, but not necessarily comply with all the prescriptive requirements in the building code? So that's a specialist field almost, and a lot of local authorities won't touch it because they're scared of liability, whereas a lot of that work is done by certifiers.
And what about inspection during construction?
Generally, certifiers don't do a lot of inspection during construction. Normally it is the licensed contractors who take the responsibility for inspection. They have certain statements they have to sign off. It may be a number of contractors, or it may be a principal builder who does the whole lot, and that builder has subsequent contractors. If a certifier is engaged to carry out inspections and sign off on completion of certain stages, then that is usually when you have a real owner builder, someone who really is hammering in the nails. But other than that, it's usually a licensed contractor. We do inspections in other aspects. We may help people out as a individual or independent party, even though the builder might say, we've finished the work and it's okay. Some owners want someone else to come in and just go over it again as an independent party. And we do that sort of inspection. And again, we get back to having good documentation to enable that. Inspections generally done by a local authority. They have the power to serve notices under the Act. The certifier doesn't. So again, good documentation is really important. Most local authorities would have a policy on inspection. They would maybe do 1 in 5 or 1 in 10 buildings. And other than that, it's at call. Not a lot of other inspection done by certifiers generally, unless we're called in to give advice on some particular matter.
Tell me about getting approval for different stages of the work.
Staged approvals was initially designed for major projects, multi-storey or major subdivisions where you may have a stage 1 of 20 houses and a stage 2 of another 10, something like that. But it has been applied for simple building consents in order to enable people to get started. So if you've got a relatively straightforward project, even though there's a lot of design work to come, if the basics are there, the footings or the site works or whatever it may be, then sure, we can do a staged approval. And that means just for that element of the work. There still must be enough documentation to ensure that the site works, excavation, perhaps the drainage, those things are still accommodated. So there's enough there to say, okay, if you build that stage, that's not going to affect any later stage. That's fine. That doesn't happen a lot, but certainly with some big projects, with, as I said, a lot of design work to go, that's a way to get started. There may be many months of work involved in the footings, the slab area, and during that time they will complete all of the other documentation. There may be fire services, mechanical services, all those sorts of things. And that's a good way of doing it. So certainly, yes, we can do staged approvals. And if you're going to do a staged approval though, it's important to try and recognise early that you're going to do that. Some local authorities need to be comfortable in the knowledge that your staged approval doesn't mean they're going to have a problem further down the track. Now that's okay if it's one single building, but certainly if you're talking about stages of development with groups of housing or industry or whatever it may be, sometimes that whole project needs some basic infrastructure approval before you can get a staged approval. So you need to be upfront with that, with the council, even at the planning stage. You need to say to them, I think because of the nature or the size of the project, I'm going to have to do it in stages. I'm going to have to do some roadworks or earthworks, then I'm going to have to do some footings and this sort of thing, and then I'll do the superstructure. It might only be 3, but it's worth doing that up front or acknowledging it up front. If you don't do the stages and you incorporate them all into one approval, that's fine. The problem would be if you think you're going to do it in one approval and then you decide to split it, you'll find the local authority won't be happy. And we're back to where we started from. They might say, hang on, we want this to be split now into a whole new application because we want to be sure that our stages are going to be covered by way of separate approvals to ensure we have the legal recourse on it for no other reason. So stages, good idea in certain instances. For what I would call moderate projects, I would try and avoid it. It's just not a simple process anymore at all. It's very, very difficult, very, very complex. The government wants to make it simpler and they keep making legislation to try and make it simpler, and they've done that with some new rules this year, but that's relation to minor works, you know, your verandas, garages and small additions to houses, but not to major development.
It's going to be hard in a litigious society that we live in. It's going to be very difficult to potentially streamline it in the way that they want to get it, I guess.
I think so. A lot of people want it to happen quickly, but when something goes wrong, they'll regret that.
That's exactly right.
So it's like everything else. I think good planning, if there are things to keep in mind, it's forward planning, good planning, get some good advice, and even though you may have to pay for some of that up front, that's really like good insurance. It really is worthwhile. And if someone's new at it, it's very hard to go out and just pick a site and go, oh, that looks big enough, I can fit 6 units on it, without understanding what some of the implications of that might be. How do I fire rate it? What do I do for drainage? If it's not just a commercial development but a major residential development, what are the green issues now? Water conservation, energy efficiency, all those things. So many things going through your mind, and you try and deal with them up front. That's very hard to do. I'm not sure all of us have all of the answers, but that's how it's evolving a little bit. You have planners, you have engineers, you have certifiers, building surveyors, whatever. Those people collectively are able to pull together all of the legislative requirements. As onerous as they may be, you try and pull them together in a manner that hopefully fits so that you have a development that you can comfortably approve, knowing that you've met the objectives of the Development Act, the government and the Building Code of Australia.
And legally you're safe.
And legally you're safe.
David, thanks so much for your time.
No, it was a pleasure. Thank you very much. I hope it's helpful.
Thank you.